In the early 19th century, Australia was a land of pickpockets, prostitutes and ne'er-do-wells. If the little colony was going to succeed, and in order to raise the tone of the neighbourhood, so to speak, they desperately needed more people who weren't criminals. But how were they going to do that? I've embarked on a journey across space and time. No European had ever seen anything like this before. Australia started as a social experiment that was completely barking mad. So I'm looking for clues to explain what made this eclectic and sometimes eccentric nation what it is today. Society was transformed. In this episode, I'm stepping into the shoes of a generation of settlers who've come to call Australia home.
They were very confident that they were leading the world, and they were proud that they were leading the world.
The welcome mat was put out. She accepted huge amounts of migrants from all over war-torn Europe. And it was pulled away. The government said, no, you're not coming in. But the millions of migrants, even those who weren't wanted, now love to tell you Australia is the lucky country.
What a great country where your destiny is in your own hands.
To work out why, I have to go right back to the days of the convicts. The little colony of New South Wales had a big problem. There was a desperate shortage of skilled labour, and the transport of convicts from the UK was about to come to an end. A solution was urgently needed. A plan was hatched to flog off Crown land and use the money to recruit much-needed skilled labour from Mother England. They called it the Bounty Scheme, which makes me think of bounty hunters, and to some extent, that's the truth. Agents bobbed up in England and went around trying to talk unemployed people into moving to the colony. The more they signed up, the more money they made. So they weren't as fussy as they should have been about checking the skills of those they recruited. When the ship arrived in port, a doctor would come on board. He'd check to make sure that the passengers were healthy, and if they were, then the shipping company would be paid some money. So, for instance, in 1840, the going rates were, if you were a husband and wife, then you were worth £38. For a child up to the age of 7, definitely under 7. £5. May we call your child between the age of 7 and 15? £10. For an unmarried female domestic of childbearing age, 19 quid. In just 1 year, 20,000 bounty migrants made the journey. And there was one quality that marked the new arrivals as different from those who'd come before. A great many of them were women.
The colonial governments were looking for fit, healthy people, but particularly women. There were so many men here during the convict era that they really needed to try and attract women to the colonies.
Must have been pretty scary for a woman to come here on her own to what had been a convict colony.
Absolutely, and it's my argument that they're really enterprising, courageous women who came on what they actually called bride ships.
Why did they call them bride ships?
Because they needed women as workers and also as marriage partners for the overwhelming numbers of men.
How did they persuade women to come over here?
The imperial government back home in London produced posters. They were put up in shops, in post offices. Ministers and priests used to talk about the ships from the pulpits. And so very educated women as well as less skilled women came out to Australia.
What kind of jobs did they do when they got here?
They're employed in a whole range of jobs, from governesses right through to dairy maids, cheesemakers, and a whole range of domestic service.
Do you think those women had much of an influence on the Australian character?
I think so. People say the Australian character has been determined largely by the Irish convicts, but I think there's a pretty good argument to say the character of Australian women really follows down in a line from these very gutsy, courageous immigrant bounty women.
The bounty scheme lasted less than 6 years. It collapsed under a deluge of complaints about migrants turning up without the skills they'd claimed to score themselves a free ticket. But not all the new arrivals were non-contributors. Some bounty migrants did really well. There was one bloke called Henry who started life in bitter poverty on a farm in England. Then later he lived in a single room with his pregnant wife in London and he couldn't get a job. He read the propaganda that said he could earn a fantastic 40 to 50 shillings a week in Australia, applied for a free passage and emigrated. And look how he ended up. Here he is on the $5 note, the nearest that Australia's got to a George Washington, a great politician, the father of federation, Henry Parkes. That free passage was a pretty good investment, wasn't it? It was still an incredibly perilous thing to journey to the colony on the other side of the world at that time. Lives were lost on almost every ship. But few events in colonial history capture the dangers of immigrant travel better than the disaster that took place at a spot called The Gap, just outside Sydney Harbour in August 1857. Imagine the scene. It was pitch black, there was thunder, lightning, and the good ship Dunbar was coming towards the end of an arduous and long 81-day journey from England, when suddenly it was hit by one of Sydney's legendary southerly squalls, and this one was a big one. Captain Green had got a tough call to make. He could either stay out at sea and weather the storm, or he could try and navigate through the heads and bring the ship and the 122 people on board into the safe haven of harbour. He decided to bring her in, and it was a fatal decision. Captain Green, who'd been to Sydney 8 times before, drove his ship into the cliff face. Kieran, what's known of the events of that night?
On the night the Dunbar was wrecked, we believe the actual waves and the spray were actually washing over the cliffs behind us, so 50, 60 metres into the air. The impact was incredible. The decks were swept clean of people, utter confusion. These people were coming to Australia. They were one day out from one of the safest harbours in the world. They were probably asleep in their bunks, all below decks. Next minute, the water would have been pouring in, women and children screaming and men trying to save the vessel. But it was all too late. The ship began to break up.
It was so close to the shore, I'm surprised that virtually everybody died.
Only one survivor, James Johnson, only survived by managing to scramble up the last remaining mast and then getting onto the cliff face. No one else managed to do that.
Was it known as a dangerous coast in the mid-19th century?
Sydney Harbour has always been raved about as being a very safe harbour, and it is internally a very safe harbour. Off the coast, however, there's about a shipwreck every 6 kilometres, and around the entrance to Sydney Harbour is approximately 100 shipwrecks. Australia has over 9,000 shipwrecks around the coastline.
But shipwrecks weren't the only dangers facing emigrants. there were also the invisible killers on board. It's a wonder that anyone arrived here at all to help kickstart the new colony, because if shipwrecks didn't get you, then disease would. That was certainly true of one particular ship that's gone down in maritime history because of the dreadful series of events that unfolded on her. She was called the Ticonderoga. An American-built megaship who could carry twice as many people as most other vessels of the era. Bigger ships meant more profits for the shipping companies. Passenger comfort wasn't their concern. Almost 800 souls crammed the double decks of the Ticonderoga, mostly young families with their sights set on starting a new life. But unbeknownst to them, on board there lurked an invisible killer. Deadly typhus, a terrible disease transmitted by lice. Sadly, it took the children first, and among them was little one-year-old Caroline Lambton. There's always something bleak about a burial at sea. Caroline's body would have been sewn in sailcloth, weighted down with chains or iron bars, and then placed on a little wooden board. Then the family and the passengers and the crew would have gathered round. The captain would have read the service. A little bell would have rung. And when the captain got to the words, "We therefore commit her body to the sea," the board would have been lifted and Caroline would have been tipped into the ocean. And then the ship would have sailed on. No grave, no memorial, just a vast emptiness. But Caroline wasn't the last. 2 months from port, it became a full-blown epidemic. More than 100 people died on the journey as the disease flourished in conditions as cramped as a giant sardine can. By now, the stench from all the typhoid victims was overwhelming. 2 or 3 people a day were dying, the medical supplies had run out, and it was freezing cold. In bad weather, they couldn't throw the bodies overboard, and they had to stack them on the decks. In good weather, it was even worse. There were sharks swimming around the boat now, and every time a body went over, a shark would snatch it and swim away with it. In fact, the sailors started throwing the bodies of the children and the babies overboard at night so that the parents could avoid the grief of seeing what the sharks did to them. 90 days after her departure, the Ticonderoga limped into Port Phillip Bay, flying the yellow flag to alert the Port Authority of the dangers aboard. Captain Draper of the pilot boat that met the ship wrote in his log, "The large ship got into Port Phillip safely. She was crowded with passengers and they all called out in frightful yells, 'Don't come on board, as we're dying of fever.' They had lost 102 on the passage." The Ticonderoga was a tragic start to a wave of migration that had no precedent anywhere in the British Empire. Within the next few years, ships from all over the world were making Melbourne, the muddy little settlement on Port Phillip Bay, the #1 travel destination in the world. And it wasn't the weather that brought them, it was this stuff. Gold. More hopeful prospectors turned up in just 2 years than arrived in 80 years of transportation. From all corners of the globe they came and spread out across the countryside like a plague of locusts, cutting it down and digging it up. But not all were welcome. The Chinese were the largest foreign contingent on the Victorian goldfields, almost 1 in 10 of all miners, and they were good at it too. In just 1 year, they shipped more than 5.5 tons of bullion back to China. Perhaps Perhaps their success bred envy. Perhaps it was their lack of Christianity, which at that time many considered the measure of human worth. Whatever the reason, they were an easy target. They levelled all sorts of ridiculous allegations against the Chinese, exactly the kind of thing you'd expect when racial tensions hot up. They accused them of muddying the water so that other people couldn't pan for gold properly. They said they trawled their way through the mining rubble that belonged to the Europeans. They accused them of importing un-Christian vices. There was even an organisation called the Anti-Chinese League that toured the goldfields, trying to wind up the diggers against them.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be among like-minded, white, Christian friends, English friends. This great British colony is in danger of becoming overrun with hordes of godless, barbarian Chinese. And as their numbers keep growing, the animosity between the Chinese and the Europeans is only getting worse. A halt to all Chinese immigration is required immediately.
The Chinese were often victimised, most famously in the riot at Lambing Flat in New South Wales. Later, when the gold fever subsided, most Chinese miners returned to their ancestral homes. Those who stayed simply added to the multi-ethnic fabric of the new society that gold had created. Their greatest challenge wasn't racism. It was finding a home to raise their children in the overcrowded cities. For years, a ring of canvas had encircled Melbourne, a tent city to accommodate the thousands arriving weekly to seek their fortune. Everyone knew a more permanent housing solution had to be found, and when it did arrive, it came in packing cases. Prefabricated iron houses, manufactured in England and shipped out in wooden crates to be assembled like giant Meccano sets, would house the growing numbers who wanted something better than a tent to call home. There used to be hundreds of metal houses like this one here in Melbourne. In fact, that area behind me is still known as Tin Pan Alley. They were made of corrugated iron. They were only ever supposed to be temporary, and one of the good things about these is that they do still keep out the rain. All this is a bit of a surprise, isn't it? The whole place looks much nicer than you might have expected. The reason is because although the walls are made of metal, they've been covered over with wood. In this case, it's the packing cases that the bits for the house originally came in. But there was one problem that even the wood couldn't eradicate. Because the walls were made of metal, they were freezing cold in the winter and boiling in the summer. Still, at least it was better than living in a tent all year round. Cool, this one's seen better days, hasn't it?
Yes, I'm afraid it has. We need a millionaire for this one.
How many do you reckon there were in Melbourne?
There were, in this area, hundreds of buildings, not just houses, all sorts of buildings. But I think there were over 30,000 brought into the colony.
Why so many?
People were rushing to the colonies after the gold rush in 1851, and of course there was no accommodation for them. A lot of the tradesmen had gone off to the goldfields. So the government originally put aside a camping ground, and then, of course, when they were able to release land for sale, entrepreneurs very quickly took advantage of that and started to become property developers. You could actually choose the house you wanted from a catalogue.
Could anyone build one of these?
That was the theory, and the idea was that you could pick them up from the docks and perhaps even in a day put them together because they just generally bolted together.
So you didn't need a builder to come in?
Not necessarily, no.
What kind of people would have lived here?
Well, it's interesting. You would think it was perhaps the poorest people in the local community, but that's not the case. You had a mixture of people, civil servants, carpenters, stonemasons, etc.
It's a miracle that even one of these iron kit homes survived. Melbourne, probably more than anywhere else on Earth, was in a state of constant evolution in the late 19th century. Flush with tax revenue from the diggings, the civic leaders tried to build Rome in a day. Ornate banks, hotels and coffee palaces sprang up. In 1885, a visiting English journo called it Marvellous Melbourne. Of course, this wasn't well received by the other colonies. Sydney hated that Melbourne had replaced it as the #1 city in the Antipodes. But in truth, rivalry existed between all the colonies, who saw themselves as unique, independent, and somehow superior to the others. Let's draw you a picture. This is just a rough idiot's guide for rough idiots like me. But in 1788, the First Fleet arrived here in Botany Bay, and for the next 40 years or so, there was only one colony. It was called New South Wales, and it stretched right from here in the north of Australia all the way right to the bottom, and it even included this massive island called Van Diemen's Land. In fact, throughout some of that time, it even included New Zealand, which was way over the sea in that direction. But then, in 1825, the people of Van Diemen's Land decided they wanted their own colony and created what we now know as Tasmania. Meanwhile, on the other side of this huge bit of land, right here somewhere, there was a little outpost called the Swan River Colony, which became Perth. They decided that they wanted to be a colony too and created Western Australia. And then down here, you've got a bunch of free settlers, not convicts, around Adelaide. They set up South Australia, originally went round like that, and then eventually shot all the way up here to the north coast. Over here you've got Brisbane and Queensland nicks the top third of New South Wales, and down here you've got Melbourne. It was originally called Batmania, after a bloke called John Batman. I don't know why they changed the name to Melbourne. Batmania is such a cool name. But anyway, they eventually create Victoria. Then finally, this top half of South Australia gets taken away from them, and they set up the Northern Territory here. Very interesting, but not quite as exciting as sandcastles. The point of the story is that all these 6 colonies developed in relative isolation from each other because they were separated by long sea journeys. But the world was changing. 2 of Great Britain's sworn enemies, Germany and France, had bases nearby. Fear of invasion got people talking. Having the colonies unite for their own defence seemed like a good idea. But it would be easier said than done.
The train on platform 3 goes to Lithgow. First stop, Glenbrook, Blackburn, Greenwood, then Port.
In Europe or America, you don't really have to go very far to get to the next town. But in Australia, you can drive for a whole day without seeing another human being. Back in the 19th century, it could take weeks to get from one place to the next because the only way to do it was by sea. Everyone understood that the colonies simply had to join forces if they were going to defend themselves. But how could they do it? Well, the answer was simple. It was a no-brainer, a network of railways crisscrossing the continent, easy peasy. Well, actually it wasn't. It proved so difficult, it became almost impossible. And it was for the most childish of reasons. In the 1850s, both New South Wales and Victoria decided they wanted brand new shiny railway systems, and they both opted for the broad gauge system. At least they did until the last moment when New South Wales changed its mind and went for a standard gauge. But then Queensland thought to itself, we can't afford all this high tech. We'll go for the narrow gauge system, which was much cheaper, but also went round bendy corners much more efficiently. And apparently there were lots of bendy corners in Queensland at the time. To make matters worse, South Australia went for a combination of the broad gauge and the narrow gauge. So you'd got all these different gauged railways chuntering round Australia. Now, you would have thought that at that moment someone would have said, wait a minute, guys, decide on one single gauge so you can transport all your people and your industry and your armies round this great emerging country without them having to change trains all the time. But it didn't happen. In fact, when all these great railway systems converged in the 1880s, they didn't join up. It meant that if you wanted to go from Perth to Darwin, you had to get on a train, change onto another train, and another, and another, and another, and another. 7 different trains from Perth to Darwin. And it wasn't until 2004, 35 years after man landed on the moon, that Adelaide was finally connected to Darwin by standard gauge railway. So how did the 6 independent colonies finally join together as a nation? Well, it might have started with a bet. Remember Henry Parkes, the bounty migrant on the $5 note? The story goes he boasted to the Governor of New South Wales, Lord Carrington, that he could federate the colonies in 12 months if he just put his mind to it, and Carrington dared him to try. So at 74 years of age, Parkes took up the challenge. A few months later, in October 1889, he made a famous speech. The great question, whether the time has not now arisen for the creation on this Australian continent of an Australian government. Australia has now a population of 3.5 million, and the American people numbered only between 3 and 4 million when they formed the great Commonwealth of the United States. The numbers are about the same, and surely what the Americans have done by war, the Australians can bring about in peace. Thank you very much. And with those words, Henry Parkes, the bounty migrant, planted the metaphorical seeds of federation. And a year later, in 1890, right here outside Melbourne's Parliament House, he planted another seed, an acorn, which became that, the Federation Oak. And the idea of federation, like that oak tree, grew and prospered. Despite all the pettiness and squabbling, the fathers of federation finally got their daughter to the altar. It took a while, nearly a decade in fact, but by 1898 a majority of the colonies said yes to becoming one Australian people. Sadly, Parkes didn't live to see it. 10 years after Parkes's famous speech, a small delegation of Australian politicians arrived in London to negotiate the passing of the Federal Constitution Act through the British Parliament. They returned home with a blueprint for the creation of a new country, most notable for the amount of compromise and amendment it contained. But while the 6 colonies were now the 6 states of Australia, they hadn't all agreed to join. Nope, it's like that old line about not wanting to belong to any club that will have you as a member. Ironically, it was only after this momentous law had been passed in Britain that Western Australia decided to have a referendum on whether or not there should be a Commonwealth of Australia. To its credit, all women were allowed to vote, and to its credit too, they said yes. Inauguration, the fulfilment of the dreams of so many, took place on a steamy New Year's Day in 1901 at Centennial Park, Sydney. Present was Queen Victoria's grandson, the Duke of York, and as many as 150,000 proud Australians. The nation's first parliament was opened a few months later at Melbourne's exhibition buildings. 12,000 dignitaries packed the hall to pose somberly for the recording of the occasion by one of the country's most loved artists, Tom Roberts. So what sort of country was Australia to be? The country's founding fathers dreamt of a model democracy based on equality and freedom. But some were more equal than others. The utopian paradise would be for white people only. For the dream to be realised, the walls of Fortress Australia would have to be strengthened. How they set about that task is one of the darkest moments in Australia's short history. The Commonwealth of Australia was born, but it was a less than auspicious start. One of the first things debated in the House was the Immigration Restriction Act. In time, it became known simply and ominously as the White Australia policy. At its core is an idea invented by the British and perfected in South Africa: the dictation test. To enter the country, you have only to write down 50 words as read to you by a customs official. But there's a catch. The words can be in any European language. The intention was to keep out non-whites, but the test could also be used to exclude anyone deemed undesirable. The whole business of the dictation tests came to a head in 1934 over a bloke called Egon Kisch, who was kicked out of his home in Nazi Germany because he was not only a Jew, he was a political activist and an anti-fascist and a communist. So he tried to get into Australia, but when his boat arrived in Fremantle, the government said, no, you're not coming in. So the boat sailed on to Port Melbourne. Once again, the government said, you're not coming in. And there was a little crowd round the boat, and Kisch was so excited, he jumped off it. And this was a big ocean liner, and when he hit the harbour side, he smashed his leg in. But the police just carried him back on board. Eventually, he was brought ashore in Sydney on crutches to sit the infamous dictation test, which had been used to successfully exclude so many. But Egon was fluent in lots and lots of European languages. So what could the government do to keep him out?
Come in and have a seat.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Okay. And we'll start. Naher, ha, nef.
Could you say that again, please?
Naher, ha, nef.
Kisch was asked to transcribe the Lord's Prayer from an obscure branch of the Gaelic language, rarely spoken outside the Hebrides Islands of Scotland.
Hickich do rioch. Naran lachel. Agus yn chwach.
Remember, this is a test for entry to Australia. And Egon is being asked to take a dictation in one of the least spoken languages in Europe.
Gu shiori. Amen. Thank you very much. Have a look at it.
The public and the media thought this test had been daft. The case went to the courts and eventually Kisch was allowed into Australia. So what did he do? He went all around the country, attending meetings, telling everyone that Hitler was evil, that the Nazis wanted a big war, and that they'd build huge concentration camps. See, the government was right. He was a radical loony. Did I pass?
This is a fail.
I did get amen right, didn't
You
I?
got amen right, but I cannot see any other correct words in here. Thank you.
Was Australia the only country that was implementing this kind of policy?
No, Australia was part of a much larger club, really, but they were very confident that they were leading the world, and they were proud that they were leading the world. The White Australia policy was really Australia's declaration of independence, because on the one hand, technically, we didn't become completely independent from Britain, but it was Australia's way of saying, this is our particular distinctive country.
Why did the politicians want to do that?
They thought that a white democratic country would have a much higher standard of living, that everybody could be equal, that everybody would share all of these things, but the everybody, of course, meaning whites only.
How long did this stream of what we would think of as racist legislation exist in Australia?
Australia continues to proudly define itself as White Australia well into the 1940s, when both through internal domestic protest and a sort of a growing sense of shame, and also a lot of external pressure, and we start to retreat from that notion of Australia as a sort of white bastion. And the dictation test is actually repealed in 1958, which I think is some sort of recognition, of what a terrible, dastardly role it played.
In the years before World War II, it was said Australia was more British than Britain.
Off you go now. Don't be late. Bye, Mummy. Bye-bye.
40 years of racially based immigration had created a bastion of white Europe in what remains geographically Asia. But the war had an unexpectedly positive effect on the Australian economy. After decades riding on the sheep's back, the country was forced to industrialise for the war effort. Now the young nation desperately needed more people to complete the transformation into a modern industrial society.
So under the slogan, populate or perish, she accepted huge amounts of migrants from all over war-torn Europe, and they transformed Australia forever.
So how did the government do it? They simply told the Australian people that the new migrants were really just like us.
Well, it took a long time, eh? But we're there at last.
But in fact, the first group to arrive were from war-ravaged Europe. Refugees grateful to start life anew as far from their old homes as it was possible to be. And they just kept coming, each new wave making its own unique contribution to an ever-changing society. Many were sent to work on remote public works projects, like the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme, and they toughed it out. In so doing, they played a huge role in creating the long period of prosperity that lasted into the 1970s. The dominance of white Australia was slowly fading away. But there was one group of post-war migrants who were given no choice in starting new lives in the lucky country. They're sometimes referred to as Britain's stolen generation, taken from their parents and shipped to Australia for their own good. 10,000 children left the British Isles under the Child Migrant Scheme, which lasted almost 20 years and did untold damage to so many families.
Your early years were in an orphanage?
Right up to the age of 10.
So how did they tell you that you were going to be sent to Australia?
They separated 3 of us
from the other children, and we thought we were something special. We were given special food, special clothes, and told that we were going to Australia. And we didn't know where Australia was, never heard of it.
Weren't you worried that you'd never be able to track your parents down?
I didn't know anything about my parents. I was told my parents were dead. But 1953, when I was coming to Australia, the first time they'd ever mentioned it, I was told, your parents are both dead and you have no brothers and sisters.
And they put you in another orphanage?
Well, here's the orphanages. This is a photo of me. That was in Glasgow when I was 5 years old.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's...
That's the boat?
That's the ship that I came out on. Yeah. It's the New Australia. This is in Geraldton, 300 miles north of Perth. That's where I grew up till I was 17. And this is me when I arrived in Geraldton.
What kind of jobs did you do when you came back to Australia?
In the orphanage, I was in the kitchen cooking for 200 people, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. 5 o'clock in the morning we got up, and 8 o'clock we went to bed without a penny paid.
Do you think people still have hang-ups about the experience that they underwent?
Yes, a lot of the child migrants do. A lot of them haven't really been able to talk about it to anybody, and so they've bottled it up inside.
It's a bit of a stain on the governments, isn't it?
I suppose it is, but I mean, when you look into the history of different countries, they've all got these hidden secrets that haven't yet come out. I mean, how long did it take for the Australian government to say sorry to the stolen generation, the Aboriginals from Australia?
To anyone who lived in Australia at the time of the Second World War, the multicultural face of any modern city would be incomprehensible. Since the middle of the 20th century, more than 7 million people have immigrated to Australia's sandy shores. Many of those post-war migrants now have Australian-born grandkids and consider themselves as Aussie as a Vegemite sandwich. But it's fair to say not every new wave of migrants has been welcomed with open arms. As this wall and this area of Sydney attest, Australia is a nation of immigrants. And no wave of new arrivals has had more impact than the 100,000 Vietnamese who arrived in the late 1970s and early 1980s, escaping a humanitarian catastrophe. Nonetheless, at the time, many Australians opposed their arrival. It's estimated that as many as 250,000 people died trying to escape the horrors in their homeland. But one of the lucky ones who made it grew up to become one of Australia's favourite comedians, Anh Do.
Oh,
very
not
nice.
bad.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is your patch, isn't it? Everybody wants to stop you and say hi.
I grew up here, Tony. Yeah, a lot of Vietnamese here. I came over to Australia on a boat. I was a refugee. 40 Vietnamese on a 9-metre fishing boat, Tony. 5 days at sea, we ran out of food and water. At one point, we were attacked by pirates.
So you're how old at this time?
I was 2.5. 9 men with knives, machetes and guns rammed their boat into ours.
Yeah.
And they climb onto our boat, they take everything. And then one of the pirates picks up the smallest child on the boat. He lifts up the little baby, and he rips open the baby's nappy, and 150 Australian worth of gold falls out, right?
Yeah,
and the pirate swears and dangles the kid over the ocean, threatens to throw the baby in. My father screams out, "We have to save the child, it's a big standoff." For whatever reason, the pirate decides to spare the kid's life. He throws him back in and he lets him live. And that's a good thing, because that kid is my little brother, Hua Do. You know what, Tony? Hua Do was 6 months old at the time. He grew up to become the 2005 Young Australian of the Year for his work with charity.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Was it difficult for you when you got over to Australia?
Not at all. Australia is such a welcoming country, you know.
I wasn't expecting you to say that. I thought you would tell me about all the racism and being picked on and everything.
Yeah, no, not at all. The first thing that happened, actually, was a nun came and gave my family a big box of clothes. And half the clothes were for a little boy and half were for a little girl, right?
Yeah.
And there's me and my little brother. Now, my mum is too polite to give the clothes back.
Yeah.
She dresses my brother in girls' clothes for the first 6 months we're here.
This is the one who became the Young Australian of the Year.
Absolutely. So if you have a little boy and you want him to become future Young Australian of the Year, put him in a little dress. That's the secret.
The notorious dictation test is long gone. But you still have to sit an exam if you want to become a citizen of this country. So would Anh Do, who is obviously an outstanding contributor and an asset to Australia, be able to pass the test? Right, this is the citizenship test. You want to have a crack?
Mm-hmm. I studied law, Tony.
This should be no problem for you
Should be
at
a
all.
piece of cake.
Which arm of government has the power to interpret and apply laws? The legislative, the executive, or the judicial?
Executive.
Get out of this country. You know nothing. You're an ignorant man.
Doesn't an executive sound like it's the top notch?
Yeah, but I think it's
The
wrong.
most important?
What is the name of a proposal to make a law in Parliament? Royal assent, bill, or debate?
Assent. Is that assent?
I think you're banned from the country, mate.
I'm gone.
What kind of questions would you want to see?
Oh, you know, Aussie ones, like it's Saturday morning, it's starting to drizzle a bit. Do you mow the lawn now or do you wait till tomorrow? You know? And take the risk that it'll rain all weekend.
Just tear this up, shall we?
That's it.
What do these admission tests say about Australia today? This is one of the most multicultural countries on Earth and one of the most peaceful. The experiment in opening the doors to people from all countries is clearly working. And yet the debate about who should be welcome is as hot as it ever was. If you came out here nowadays, though, it wouldn't be that kind of welcome, Matt, would it? You'd be the yellow peril. You'd be the guys who are coming over here swamping Australia with noodles and spring rolls.
I don't think so. Certainly refugees are being viewed differently at the moment. I think after September 11, Australians are more fearful of things that are different from the outside, you know? We've become a little bit more insular.
It is tougher to get in now, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. It is. Certainly by boat it is.
You're so up about the whole thing. I'm trying to goad you into telling me what a terrible place this is, how we whites dominate you all the time, and you won't give an inch.
Well, you know, as soon as my parents arrived, they said, "Anh, what a great country this country Australia is," and that's how they brought us up, you know?
Yeah.
What a great country where your destiny is in your own hands. Kids, if you give it a crack and see what happens, you can really make something of your life. That's what Mum and Dad taught us.
His brother's Young Australian of the Year. It ought to have been you, mate. I do wonder if Australia's willingness to accept outsiders has changed in recent years. Something I know from my travels is that taxi drivers give you a pretty good handle on the views of a country. What would happen if I surveyed a few and asked them, do they think the welcome mat is still out? Do you think you're more suspicious of foreigners than your kids are?
Oh, yes. I used to make statements not necessarily friendly towards a lot of newcomers, and my kids used to be horrified. They'd say, "Dad, how can you say such things?"
What about racism in Australia?
To be honest, I haven't come across to those peoples.
Is there a problem about so much migration?
I think we need it. We have a very small population and we need it for the economy of the place.
In more recent times, we've seen so many changes that you just get used to change, and it's not a problem at all.
Australians in general, they don't want to hurt you, but they don't really care much.
When I came here, I've been given a very strange advice. You when you get to a certain place that you're not aware of or you don't know much about it, you ask the cab driver how things are and stuff like that. He said, you should be careful. And I said, about what? And he said, 2 W's, a weather and a woman. They're very unpredictable. So that was the advice from a cabbie 21 years ago.
And you've taken that advice?
I did.
There we go.
Thanks a lot, mate. I think many Australians still wrestle with the question of who should be welcome in their country. But they also see themselves as a nation of immigrants, which is true. A quarter of the country's 22 million people were actually born overseas. And when you think about it, even the original inhabitants, the Aborigines, migrated here, albeit more than 40,000 years ago. From the start of white settlement to the recent wave of immigration from East Africa, Australia's grand narrative has been the story of people coming to this vast continent and finding their place in it. And for most of them, it's a story with a happy ending. In the next and final leg of my journey, I'm going to explore what more than 200 years of European settlement has created.
Anyone fancy fish and chips?
How Australia grew up.
They're wrestling on the bridge. Wrestling on the bridge.
To become the country she is today.
Hey.
Hang on. It could be a bumpy ride.
Whoops.